Welcome everyone to CG seminar with the interesting number of 213 in 5.5 years. And today we're going to talk about China's Young Talents Program and we're going to look at some data on what happens when the returnees return. But before I introduce our presenters, let me take you through the web protocols in the usual way. Now, the webinar is being recorded. It winds up on YouTube within 48 hours or so. And of course, you can access that through our website. And we also post the chat from the webinar on the website as well. Now, during the webinar, we advise you to keep yourself muted unless you have been asked to speak or you're asking a question. And likewise, there's no need to have your video on during the webinar, but do turn on your video and your audio when you're asking questions. We recommend using the speaker view so you can more clearly see who is talking at any given time. You're at liberty to use the gallery setting, which gives you everyone at once if you wish, but speaker view will enable you to focus your participation just that little bit better. Now, to ask a question, and we do encourage Q&A as an important part of the webinar, use the chat function, put your question or your statement into the chat, and I will select the Q&A participants on the basis of what's coming up there. So it's generally a good idea to come in early and to make your question pertinent to the presentation. That's the basis on which I select people. At the end of the presentation, when the two speakers in this case have finished, we'll then move into the Q&A, and I'll invite participants, usually be able to give you a warning, I think, in the chat, so you'll know your name is going to come in. And when you're invited to ask your question or make your statement, please unmute yourself, turn on your camera, and state your name and where you are from, and then say what you wish to say. Now, I'm very happy to introduce two colleagues, one recent former colleague who's still, of course, active in our circles. That's Giulio Marini. Giulio is a lecturer in teaching at the Social Research Institute, and he's affiliated to the Quantitative Social Science QSS-SRI and Centre for Higher Education Studies, both in the UCL Institute of Education. So he continues his long period of work now at the Institute of Education as part of UCL in London. He's also an associate editor of European Journal of Higher Education and frequently published in the literature on higher education and related fields. Lili Yang, also a person active in the CG network, is a postdoc researcher now at CG in Oxford and working on our project comparing 10 countries in relation to the public good of higher education. She received her PhD from the University of Oxford at the end of last year. Her thesis, which is being published as a book, explores the similarities and differences between notions of public good in the Chinese and Anglo-American traditions. That's already led to a major article, and a lot of spin-offs from her thesis are now coming into print. So we look forward to what Giulio and Lili have to say. And at this point, I'll hand over to you. You can manage your own participation at this handover to each other. I'm not sure who's speaking first. Is it Giulio?
I'm speaking first.
Lili. Okay,
yeah.
Lili, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Simon. I'm going to share my screen now. Okay, I hope that works. Okay. Thank you very much for having us today. Well, in the next 30 minutes or so, Giulio and I will be sharing some of our findings from our curiosity-driven research that investigates the research performance of some Chinese returnees who received the support from a flagship talent recruitment program in China. Many of you may have heard that, the Young Talent Program. We embarked on this research in late 2017 when we were sharing a CG researcher's office at UCL. Well, the data collection, which will be covered in detail later, was primarily carried out in 2018. This time is important because at that time, the information about the recipients of this talent program was still publicly available, and we got the ethical approval. And then we immediately cleaned all of our data after collection. Some of you may have heard that such information is no longer available in the public domain to the large extent because of the American government censoring of these talents, because of the American-China tension since 2019. The Chinese government and higher education institutions chose to stop revealing relevant information of these program recipients. So unfortunately, this research design is non-replicable for future study. There are several outputs from our research. The most recent one was published in Science and Public Policy this Tuesday, based on which we developed our presentation today. So if you're interested in the research, we invite you to have a look at these outputs. All of them are open access. Now, getting to the main topic, it has been widely documented that China is becoming a competitive player in the world science system. Among China's important strategies to strengthen its research capacity is to recruit top-notch Chinese talents who have been educated and or worked in world-leading higher education institutions. We refer to these talents as globally bred Chinese talents. It's believed that by recruiting these globally bred talents, China can improve its capacity to produce high-quality research and educate their own new generations of talents domestically. As Lepori and colleagues discovered, mobility of PhD holders is key to trace leaders of the global competition in higher education and research. However, studies have also pointed out that the overall size and quality of international PhD students are still misbalanced between China and the global West. Wang and colleagues found that Chinese universities may only be attractive to some of its diaspora who have been hitherto particularly productive. Under such circumstances, as will be explained later, various efforts have been made by Chinese governments to recruit Chinese overseas talents. Cheng and Xu showed that China's ability to narrow the gap between its research capacity and the global excellence largely depends on dedicated policies of talent attraction. Specifically, researchers have revealed that in recruiting overseas diaspora, there exist various factors that can influence a person's decisions. In terms of external factors, the prestige of institutions, research environment, and support are important ones. Further, after returning to their home country, returnees' career development and research performance can be affected by a range of issues. For example, there could be problems considering readaptation, as pointed out by Ma and Pan. Resources can also play an important role, especially in STEM areas. In the Chinese context in particular, social and academic capitals are highly relevant. So overall, it's fair to argue that talent recruitment policies can make a difference in attracting and supporting the development of returnees. Indeed, implementing talent recruitment programs has become a widely adopted strategy by numerous countries seeking to attract international researchers. Countries that fail to recruit international talent and or retain domestic talent risk facing the problem of brain drain. Well-designed talent recruitment programs offering exceptionally attractive working conditions and salary packages help in turning brain drain into brain gain. China's talent attraction policies were introduced to deal with China's brain drain problem, which became an increasingly preoccupation since the late 20th century. The relatively low return of the Chinese students and scholars in the 1990s drew concerns from government officials. From the 1990s onwards, Chinese government successively issued a series of policies aiming at attracting overseas Chinese talents and dealing with the brain drain problem. Numerous national policies and schemes have been promoted by, for example, the Party Committee, the central government's ministries and commissions, central public institutions, including the Chinese Academy of Sciences and main scientific organizations such as the National Natural Science Foundation. In such context, the Young Thousand Talents program was introduced in 2011 as a sub-strand of the Thousand Talents program. The aim was to attract relatively young talents who have potential to become leading figures. The scheme of Young Thousand Talents is open to talents in any discipline, but it predominantly recruits those in STEM disciplines. Specifically, the policy states that the objective is to recruit scientists below the age of 40 who normally have at least 3-year overseas working experience. Successful recipients shall have engaged in scientific research with formal teaching and research positions in overseas prestigious universities, institutions, or enterprises. This flagship policy has attracted much scholarly attention. However, the existing discussions about the policy are mainly descriptive or qualitative studies focusing on the talent's post-return experience, lacking in-depth quantitative analysis of the program and its effectiveness and implications. The policy raises multiple implications as outlined in this table. For instance, it's relevant to know if China is able to attract back some of its brightest diaspora researchers once they have completed their education abroad. We chose to focus on comparing the research performance between these talents, young thousand talents, and their counterparts who remained in American research-intensive universities. Specifically, we ask the question of, are Chinese early and mid-career researchers who received their PhDs from world-leading higher education institutions and are recruited back to China under the scheme of the Young Thousand Talents program, better performing in terms of research quality in comparison to those who have similar education and a research experience, but continue to be affiliated in the US research-intensive universities. The data set of this study is original. It's a combination of individual CV information plus respective Scopus publications, and we collected this data manually. Individuals' publications could generate further variables. Using CV as the source of data has a long-standing tradition and a specific application in Chinese geographical field. If the person collecting the data is proficient in the language and the CVs are available in official institutional website, CV can reveal information such as age, institution of graduation and PhD attainment, and mobility trajectories. As mentioned, the list of researchers who were recruited under the Young Thousand Talents policy was of public domain at the moment of data collection. We considered the first 2 waves of this policy referring to talents who returned to China in the years of 2011 and 2012 in order to have a reasonable span of time to compare scientific production before and after the recruitment, which is our treatment moment. The first 2 waves of Young Thousand Talents list around 350 people, among whom some biographical data were available. This number drops to 183 when we excluded those not employed in universities. For example, some were working for companies and public research institutions. These researchers have been scanned individually to check if they, at the moment, still work in mainland China and if they got their PhDs in China or abroad. We include only those who got a PhD abroad. This group is a treatment group. A control group has been extracted manually from official websites of some US research-intensive universities. This sample was devised in a stratified way. Universities have been chosen in order to represent proportionately US institutions from the top 500 according to the Shanghai ranking in 2018. And the full list of these universities is provided at the end of these slides. Sampling of universities is proportionate to their places in rankings. By name, we individually collected people who belonged apparently to the same generation of the first 2 waves of the Young Thousand Talent. This is possible as information about the treated researchers' birth year and the year of a PhD attainment was available. The search was pursued in staff directories in predominantly STEM areas. Afterwards, we filtered in only those who completed up to the master level education in mainland China and obtained the PhD in leading Western universities. We pruned manually outliers by age and prestige of PhD awarding institutions against non-treated information in order to maximize the comparability. In total, the dataset comprises around 550 selected people. Researchers in both the treatment group and control group are very similar by age, career stage, doctoral background and publication record. And Giulio will provide us more details about this later on. The dataset comprises single scientific output as observations, which can be referred to as univocal authors, who in turn belong to either the treatment group or the control group. Because of the time limitation, I cannot expand on the process of data collection, but we are happy to share more information in the Q&A session. Well, I'll now hand over to Giulio.
Thank you. I think you should be able to hear me. I mute myself. Thank you. Now I will expose you some variables within the data set, so you might have an understanding of what's inside. As Lili perfectly said, we have age, year of PhD attainment. These people, they all got PhD in non-Chinese institutions. Gender, they're mostly males. Current scientific affiliation, the institution where they got the PhD. So from this, you get also the positioning rankings. And the number of citations, which is scaled by time, because, you know, if you publish something in 2021, maybe it's great, but you need time to collect citations. And so we account for this. Please, you can go to the 11th slide, please. Yes, we have other variables, type of publication. So you might have open access, and that could be interesting because open access publications could get more citations just for that. Language of publication, which is important because some people might publish in Chinese, and that would be perhaps a problem for international audiences. The typical output, so article or non-article. Social capital, that's quite important and interesting. We have the number of co-authors by each output. So if you have an article, maybe you are a single author, or maybe you are published with other 19 people, so you are 20 authors there. Degree of internationality, and also heterogeneity of co-authorships by country. Now, these kind of variables are computed by the affiliations of each author. So if you have 20 authors, maybe 10 are American US, 5 are Chinese, and then you have other countries. From this kind of information, you can have the extent to which they're Chinese and American, but also the extent to which you have different countries in publications. Institutional mobility, which is important for the cultural group because all returnees are mobile because they change it in an institution necessarily. But some Chinese people continuing to work in America, they might have continued to work in the same university. Another key variable is that one named kept relationship. So we wanted to check whether Chinese nationals in the US before the treatment period were publishing with Chinese people, which is something you can understand from the above mentioned publications. That's quite important. And in fact, this variable resulted to be very important to predict people who actually went back to China. Okay. Standing of universities, I'm not going to mention that much this set of variables. They are scientometric kind of stuff, so you might have plenty of information about the quality of institutions people are in. So yeah, we can go to the 12th slide. Okay, a chart. We're not going to have many of them, so we have been nice in terms of quantitative things. This is a basic chart. Now, P0 means before treatment. P1 means after treatment. One bracket, okay? Treatment for those who returned under the 1000 scheme, that's clear, okay? At a certain point, they went back home. For the control group, we computed something similar, the most similar kind of situation using age and year of PhD attainment. So the treatment time for the control group is theoretical. It's not real, okay? But it was used to build up this kind of comparison. What this chart does mean, above you have control group and below those who returned. From P0, we understand that the central bar is not very different from the control group and the returnees, people who eventually returned. But we see that there is no lower in this kind left side distribution for those who returned. This means that the policy filtered pretty well those who were not good. So they filtered out those who were not really performing well. So the policy in the moment of recruitment, which we don't observe, but we can deduce that they filtered out not very performative scholars. And it is also more less widespread, let's say. Interestingly, in the post-treatment period, P1, we see that apparently returnees are not doing that well. In fact, we see the median is clearly lower for the returnees, and also, the top quartile is not that great. So, according to this first gross result, this policy doesn't look like great, but with more refined analysis, we can demonstrate that that's not really the case. It is not clear, it is not linear, but to some extent, this policy works pretty well. And now we can go to the next one. Okay, this is basically the only table we show you today in order to be, to make a selection of all the data we computed. So this is a difference in different kind of analysis, and what you can see within the red kind of square, that's the kind of effect we have to look at. All the rest, the variables below, this is truncated in order to let you see something, because the screen is not necessarily very wide at your ends. I don't know what kind of screen you have, but sometimes it's a small laptop and you can't see anything. But if you check the PDF of the publication at Science and Public Policy, you can have the full table. This is a copy paste, okay? So we have to look at these in order to understand the effect accounting by covariates. So accounting by the other variables I quickly described. We have 6 models. And so we try to account for something that at a certain point became visible to us. The effect is not linear, it's curvilinear. So it's not something the more, or the more, the less. It's, not really a line, okay? So we try to understand if returning back home increases the likelihood to have publications that are good in quality, meaning receiving more citations. And so we split this distribution of citations in terms of top 1%, top 10%, first quartile, etc. First model is, are they more likely to publish in the first quartile? So the first 25% of beta publications. And the answer is yes. So from this point of view, returnees are better off in comparison to Chinese nationals continuing to work in the US. Okay, or say in global, where some people might have got a PhD in UCL, then they went to the US, say, or Oxford to US, but mostly they got a PhD in the US and they continue to work in the US. The third model, they both tell that Chinese returnees are not likely to fall in the middle league sort of distribution. So from this kind of result, we see that either they're better off or worse off, okay? And this is quite visible also from other models. And I would like to get your attention on model 5 and 6. Model 6 would be top 1%. One is truncated, sorry, but it's top 1%. So both top 1% to top 10% returnees are more likely to get those kind of publications with more citations belonging to the very top strata of citations. So we can go to the next slide, please, where basically we wrote the discussion of the previous table. So returnees are more likely to produce papers with citation within the first quartile, which was the first model. Returnees are less likely to fall in the middle league of the distribution. Returnees are more likely to result no better than no returnees. So they might fall in the last quartile. But also at the same time, returnees are more likely to produce top 1 percentile papers in comparison to control group researchers. So, which is the main result in a nutshell? It's wonderful, isn't it? We cannot really say something very clear. What we can say is that for some people, this policy works very well. It was a great option to go back to China for one's career in terms of rank, prestige, but also performance, success in terms of international recognition, because citations they come from everywhere, okay? And it is basically an absolute kind of measure. At the same time, it is not clear why in some cases it doesn't work. So here we might have a debate, and we discussed multiple times with Lili, which are the possible reasons. We have also to account that very likely these people, they don't teach that much. So they might have not a very, heavy teaching load. And they surely have good funding opportunities. So very likely it could be a problem of cultural differences, because they got a PhD in the States. So although they're really Chinese, we check it if they got their bachelor degree in China, okay? They didn't get a bachelor degree in the US. They didn't go to American high school, okay? They're really Chinese. But in terms of research culture, they basically got an American system, and in some cases it works very well when they go back to China. In other cases, it doesn't really work well, and we don't know why. So it could be an institutional problem, or maybe more likely a school problem within institution. It could be a matter of, very specific discipline, or the team you happen to work with. Something basically we didn't observe, okay? We can go to the next slide. Another issue is the evaluation kind of machinery in place in China, at least that one that used to be in place some years ago, which is the kind of system that shaped researchers' behavior. Okay, we are talking about a few years ago. That's another very sound possible explanation for this, because a few years ago, China was still insisting in quantity of outputs rather than the very quality. The idea of quality was a threshold. Whatever is above that threshold, it's okay. Now it's not anymore the case, because China is really serious in competing with Global West about quality of research. And quality is not about quantity, okay? What else? Yeah, and the last point, I think it's very important. We have to account also for the size thing. This policy is great in terms of opportunities, but if we look at numbers, we are talking about few dozens of people per year. For a country like China, it's basically nothing, okay, for China. It's not a great number. So basically, they attracted back good people, no doubts, but they attracted those who were already in touch with Chinese scholars. So a lot of people who are good, they didn't find a way to be recruited. Maybe they didn't apply at all. We don't know. That's not observed. But the margin for China to do better in this kind of things, in reversing the brain drain, is big and huge. So I see a lot of perspectives in terms of this kind of policies. Not necessarily always that generous, but there's a lot to do. If I can be for one moment in Chinese policymakers' shoes, I would say, look, let's revise this. Maybe we can make a kind of second-tier policy, but we could try to attract many more people back home. Okay. I think we are done. There is another slide, perhaps. Oh, okay, limitations. Yeah, of course. The curvilinear outcomes are not probably all observed. We can even erase probably. It's a rhetoric probably. Of course, we didn't observe everything. There are cultural aspects. And the social capital, I think we did a really good job in terms of countries, but we could have done, or in the future, we could do more research about institutional level rather than country level, and also looking at the very single people, researchers, young researchers who author with, and that could improve in the next future this kind of research. And I think we are done. That was the last slide, perhaps. Yes. Okay. Good. Thank you so much. Yeah, that's the list of American universities. We browse manually one by one, looking at the staff directories. It was very time-consuming for Giulio.
Well, thank you very much, Giulio and Lili, for that interesting presentation, which opened up a lot of questions for me. And I'm going to start the discussion, if I can, with myself. When you look at the relative position of China now, it's no longer clear that it's, a country which needs international collaboration to lift its performance. Murray Quick produced an interesting paper last year, which showed that, among other things, that China is one of the 5 countries in the world, along with the US, where the citation rate for nation-only collaboration is higher than the citation rate for internationally collaborative papers. So the old assumption that Chinese scholars go to the US, or perhaps elsewhere to a lesser extent, to build their knowledge, their capability as researchers, and of course to utilize the central position of the US and the other Western countries in the scientific networks and in publishing to launch their careers, and that provides them with a superior outcome, all else being equal, may not any longer be quite right. There's also the Jenny Lee, John Hopp papers, which have been showing that in the collaboration, the 55,000 in 2018, the collaboration papers between the US and China scholars, mostly bilateral papers, just those 2 countries, of the high citation 500, the top 500 papers in that 55,000, a much larger number are led by Chinese researchers than are led by US researchers. So it appears that, in other words, in that body of collaborative work between the US and China, it's been China scholars that have been actually leading the high quality work, all else being equal, which again would indicate that national capacity is in a different situation to what it was 10 or 20 years ago. Your results seem to give, I think, a fairly mixed picture in that regard. I wonder if you'd like to comment on that. Are Chinese scholars gaining from going to the US? Presumably we always gain something when we collaborate with anyone, but are they gaining as much as they used to in terms of building science in China?
Perhaps I could start and then Giulio could add on more points. So I definitely echo your points of the development of Chinese science system and especially the growing of national collaboration within the Chinese higher education system. But I think at the policy level, there is a strong orientation or strong preference to encourage talents, especially young talents, maybe doctoral students or early career researchers to go abroad. Even though these young 1,000 talents, it has changed the name last year into there are different strands merging into one big strand of talent recruitment policy. And then there is still strong characteristic that is requiring talents who have had international experience to go back to China. So I think maybe at the policy level, there is a strong idea that the really rapid catching up of the Chinese system to a large extent has benefited from this international mobility and returns of Chinese diaspora and this international collaboration. But as you said, there can be a change of picture because of the capacity of Chinese science has grown rapidly, and this can be a game changer, and then things will be changed in future. Do you have anything to add, Giulio?
Yeah, well, Simon, you're right. I mean, China and also the US, they don't really need to go abroad in terms of authorships in order to do something that is great. It's also a matter of size, not only a matter of quality. And few other countries in the world can have this kind of stance. Nevertheless, here we are talking about the war for talents. So now I don't want to be political, but if we think that Biden administration is different in tones and grammar, but not that much in substance, in terms of recognizing that China is a rival, okay? It is an extremely relevant issue, this one. It is extremely relevant. And so if I were a US kind of policymaker, I would try to attract Chinese people and then offer them something decent in order to make them stay there. And the other way around, if I were a Chinese policymaker, I would try to get them back. And perhaps right now they might start saying, you don't really need to get a PhD in the US, because here we have some universities are some of the best in the world now. It's not like 20 years ago when the Shanghai rankings was established. Things changed. And to change a position in the ranking is very difficult. But they managed to do it relatively quickly. I mean, it's impossible to do what China did any quicker. Okay, so yes, I agree with you with these general considerations, but in terms of policy making, I think it's really relevant. And so, as I said, I would probably try to compel some Chinese nationals not necessarily in touch with Chinese world to consider to go back to China if I were one of those Chinese policymakers.
Yes, if you saw the Leiden ranking, which came out yesterday for 2021, to see the continuing rise of Chinese science there, it's quite astonishing. Now, Tsinghua is now overwhelmingly, clearly, the strongest producer of top 1% and top 5% papers right across the physical sciences. It's gone well ahead of MIT. In 2 years, it's just jumped ahead of MIT. And there's lots of other universities following in Chinese universities. Maybe, Lili, instead of slumming it at Oxford, you would have been better off staying at Tsinghua or going to, or maybe even making the switch to Zhejiang or Beida, and you would have published more highly cited papers. But then, on the other hand, perhaps your probability of producing a top tier paper has been slightly enhanced by going abroad. But you weren't in the 1,000 Talents program, so perhaps that's not a good example. We've got a couple of people coming through on the call list, and the first one is Aki Yanazawa from Tohoku in Japan. Aki, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you. First of all, I'd like to congratulate the very interesting and very successful the paper. And I think that the Chinese academic community was very active in launching international journals. And actually, it is supported by the, if my understanding correct, that the Chinese government to financially also. And my question is that so as someone already mentioned that your result is a bit mixed or a bit complex. So how can we understand? So do you think, first of all, do you think that this phenomena pose impact on the result of your data analysis? And my actual question is that that if they return to China, maybe they have more opportunity to utilize such a national, international journal, right? So then this issue is, it seems to be that some possibility that the publication landmark mapping itself may be highly related to the mobility of the academics. So I'd like to ask your observation from this point of view.
Thank you very much for your question. Very interesting one. Actually, in addition to this encouragement and support to launch international journals in China, there was also a policy, I think, introduced last year, saying that there is a strong encouragement for scholars to publish in national journals, no matter they're in English or in Chinese. So I think from last year onwards, there will be possibly an evident trend of more publication or preference of publishing in these national journals, either international ones or national ones in Chinese ones. But because our data was collected before the 2018, and at that time, there was still kind of international journals in China was still not a very strong phenomenon. So we can't observe from the data set, but from my personal point of view, I think there will definitely play a different thing, especially maybe in terms of changing how we understand the global science. Because if more and more publications are being published in these Chinese international journals, then the previous Western hegemony, if we call it, might be challenged in a way. But it still remains unclear whether Chinese scholars and of course scholars from all over the world are willing to publish their best quality papers in these relatively new journals or not. So we might need to wait for a few more years to see how it goes. But it's definitely a very interesting thing to observe and to discuss.
Yes, I think you spotted something very important. That would be a different kind of paper. Okay. In this paper, since we consider citations, we are safe from this kind of possible critics, so to speak. If you were a reviewer, I would tell you, look, we just got citations as the main dependent variable, so that works for us. And I would say something polite, such as, you know, it's great a kind of possible next paper, and actually sooner or later us or somebody else will do this kind of research, because you become the greatest country in the world in science or in whatever if you host top journals, and you need time to do it, because if you have something established centuries ago, it's one thing. If you have something established yesterday, it's another. Okay, if you can say this university was established 6 centuries ago, it's great. I mean, Italian universities happen to have this kind of feature, and they don't exploit this, but that's another story. Italy, it's a kind of strange country to this regard. I talk as an Italian myself, but yeah, I mean, in the future, somebody will make this kind of analysis. I'm pretty sure, because it's, I mean, the efforts deployed to establish as a standard for Chinese scholars and potentially in the future also for others is great. Probably it's about not really publishing in Chinese because it's difficult, but if it is double language in English or whatever lingua franca will be in the remote future, I think that's going to happen.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And let me add that the Western journals are basically commercialized, right? Means that they are not supported by the government. And the Chinese one is supported by the government, means that it is much easier to make it open access or the less expensive, right? So that may have another kind of impact. But actually, thank you very much anyway.
I'm tempted to ask you, Aki, about the Japanese government's announcement that it wants to put a lot more money into research and science, which I think we're all very interested to see, but maybe it's a bit
but
early.
The Japanese government, they never support the journals, so that is a big issue for us.
Yes. Maybe we'll leave the discussion of Japanese policy to another time, but that struck me as a very significant development, and one which we'd all like to know more about. Sejong Lee is the next person on our call list.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Lili, and thank you, Giulio, for your presentation. So building on your last comment about your limitation, you said that you could maybe adopt more fine-grained approach for your future research. So I was wondering if your future research focused on individual researchers, which aspect would you compare with these scholars and other scholars in the US? So for instance, I was thinking maybe motivation or feeling of autonomy, agency, would give helpful implications by any chance, because researchers in the scheme might feel less autonomous if their future is already decided, and maybe less motivated, intrinsically less motivated, because they know that their future is already going back home instead of building their future as they want. So what do you think? Maybe that could be interesting to look at in the future research.
Thank you, Soyeon. That's a really interesting aspect to see. I mean, I'm personally very interested in looking at the individual level. Perhaps if we are going to do this, I would like to look at more in a qualitative perspective, especially concerning how those researchers experience after returning to China, their agency and the interaction between their agency and the structural patterns. So one important aspect, as we were not guessing, but more discussing, try to contemplating of why we had such results of this kind of talent program was this evaluation scheme in China. And as you mentioned that a researcher might not be motivated, but maybe that's not the case, because these returnees, while they receive really generous support, they were also facing very high expectations of requirements in terms of evaluation. So they have, most of them were recruited on the tenure track position. And so they were given 3 to 6 years. They need to reach a certain standard. And also this is just an early threshold in terms of talent title. So this is the first step. If they want to progress in a long term, they need to work well with this 6 period of time, and then they need to apply for other titles step by step. So there is high demanding trajectories ahead of them. So in terms of motivation, I'm not very sure, as they were already performing very well, and most of them personally are motivated researchers. So in that sense, maybe qualitative research in terms of their adaptation, their interaction with institution, and perhaps because they're returning back to China, they become a part of those have a say in reforming the academic culture in China. So that dynamic may be very interesting to explore in future.
Yeah, a quick answer to this question was when I was mentioning the individual or institutional affiliations rather than just the country one. The example is the following: if you co-author something with a person affiliated in top 10 universities in America, they're almost all American, although there's something here in Britain. It's one thing. Is their co-authoring colleague is American, but in some university which is below the first 500 universities, and whatever the ranking you refer to, it's another one. And also in terms of individuals, if you co-author with someone who is already a Nobel Prize, it's one thing. If you publish with me, it's another one. Okay, that's so obvious, and that counts for every possible discipline. If I may answer quickly to Victorita's question about type of publication, since we are not talking about humanities and social sciences, type of publication, we had multiple modes. So article in journal, chapter, book, proceedings, something as reviews. Basically, we use a binary, article, non-article, because usually the article is the main kind of output, and the rest it's okay, but it's not supposed to attract many citations, etc. So that was the kind of information we got from Scopus sort of repository. So we collect data from Scopus. I think we didn't say that, but it's Scopus kind of repository.
Thanks, Giulio. In the manner of a very gifted scholar, you've actually answered the question before it's even been asked. And Victorita was next on the call list. As a regular, I think she's probably entitled to have her say. So, Victorita, please come in.
Hi, Simon. Thank you very much. It is not necessary to admit on the platform. My colleague answered to my question. I'm really sorry. Thank you very much.
Good, thank you. No more questions. And we are very grateful to you for your regular participation in our webinars. Our other regular was Hongwei Gu, but he seems to have disappeared since the CG conference. So not sure why Hongwei's deserted us. I hope he hasn't gone to a rival webinar program somewhere, but anyway, maybe we'll wait for him to come back. But thank you both for your answers to the question. I've got a further question. In relation to duration of stay in the United States, what difference does it make if you come back quickly or you stay for a few years?
Giulio, do you think we have that kind of data that we can observe something from that?
Well, we have year of PhD attainment. And so for the returnees, we have that kind of information, and it's usually something like, I don't know, 5 years or even more. It is relatively homogeneous for those who return back home. Therefore, I wouldn't use that variable in this data set, because on purpose, we tried to get comparable things, comparable people. And usually, you know, they got a PhD in the US, certainly they got a bachelor and a master's degree in China, and then they got this offer from China when they were basically below 40. So it's relatively homogeneous. You know, to answer your question, we should probably approach a different kind of, we should set up a different data set, I think. But I think it's very important. At a certain point, you are less likely to go back home because maybe you got family, you have a wife who doesn't want to go to China, or maybe it could be also the other way around, okay? It depends by things. But yeah, it does make a difference. Having done some research about mobility, etc. But for this data set, they're pretty homogeneous, and usually at the age of 35, 40, more likely 35, they have been poached back to China, so they're pretty homogeneous.
Yeah, I'd like to add one more point from my personal observation, that because this is not the regular 1,000 Talents program, which is aiming at more well-established status of scholars. So for them, how long they have been staying in the US or in other countries may make a big difference. But for the young 1,000 Talents recipients, most of them are in their relatively young, early career stages. And they were, from my own observation, because I know some of them who have been awarded this title. So most of them were trying to stay abroad till the point that they can get this title when they return. So they were accumulating this publication, for example, top publications, in order to be successful in applying to this program. So, but normally, because there is an age limitation, so they won't stay too long in the West or in other countries. But at least for those, normally speaking, for those who got their PhDs abroad, were better off than those who got their Chinese degrees and then move abroad to do their postdocs.
Do you have data on joint appointments in this group? I mean, do we know whether if any of them have joint, appointments in China before they go back? I mean, that have affiliations and appointments in both places?
So for these young 1,000 Talents, they couldn't have these appointments before they return. So normally they were signing a contract with the institution, and the institution support them to apply for this title. And normally they know whether they are likely to get the title or not. But we had this variable of international cooperation in terms of when they were still abroad, whether they collaborate with Chinese colleagues who are based in China. And that observation we had. but in terms of affiliation, most of them, they didn't have prior affiliation with Chinese institutions.
Okay. That's interesting, isn't it? That they get to that point in their careers where so much is sort of open, you know, is, you know, question mark, big, you know, could go in many directions. Lots of things could happen. And maybe it's a good facility for the national research system, that it has that openness at that point, that people aren't locked in, that they're not subject to the sort of logic of, you know, you know, being recycled through their original master's level institutions and so on. But they could go anywhere, and that creates a mobility dynamic that, and a sort of capacity to match capacity to person, you know, at local levels, which wouldn't otherwise exist. I'm going to, at this point in the webinar, ask Giulio to make to comment on a couple of things, because he's not been part of our ongoing discussion about science in China, which we've been pursuing for more than a year in different webinars. I mean, I think we've helped to draw attention to the obvious fact that China is now such a major player, you know, in science. And if you haven't learned that by now, you would have had your head in the sand. But you know, the real dimensions of it aren't fully understood even now, I think, how important science in China has become. Giulio, how do you read this? I mean, do you think that, do you see the world as having changed substantially with the rise of China, and to some extent other, I suppose, non-European, non-North American powers like, you know, Korea and India and Iran and Brazil and so on? I mean, are things shifting in world science? How are they shifting in your view? You know, you're able to make a judgment about these things like we all do. You know, it's partly guesswork and partly based on what you know and can see. And the other question I want to ask you is a much harder one. What happens if the US really does break this close relationship that we've seen between scientists in the US and scientists in China, a very productive and effective relationship for everyone? What happens if the US really does radically reduce the amount of cooperation, the number of doctoral students, postdocs and so on in the US, and that sort of thing? Will that drive down quality in China, or is China now strong enough to sustain itself?
Yeah, it's the question of the questions right now for, you know, this first half of the century, so to speak. Well, I'm not American. I've never been in the States. I've been in China once for 1 month, but I've never done research specifically about the States. But definitely, I think with the 5G story, for instance, landing things over Mars planet, I think the US, they have pretty clear in mind that China is a more serious rival than Soviet Union used to be. Well, okay, also Soviet Union got Sputnik and other mighty achievements before collapsing, okay? That was in the 50s. I would say that consider that China is part of the global world, rather than being a half of the world as Soviet Union used to be and have, and having half Europe. It's definitely tricky to block everything right now. I mean, it's sort of Trumpist stance. Okay, now we stop everything, and it wouldn't work for the States as well. I mean, they need, as we need here in the UK, people doing postdocs. We need to populate the labs. And it is clear they do a good job. So to say now we stop awarding PhDs to Chinese nationals because we realize that they may overcome us, it doesn't work this way. I mean, you can say that, you can think for a while, you can think for a second, but then you realize it's not feasible. So it's about competing possibly in a fair way. And that's it. I think it's about doing one's best in attracting talents fairly and doing a fair competition. I mean, it's clear the stake is who is the superpower number one here, US or China? And it depends by disciplines right now, but if you look at the trend, sounds like China may surpass, may overcome the US, but I'm not sure about that or when this could happen. You know, it's different from GDP, per capita GDP in absolute terms. It's a different story. And mobility of researchers is key. I mean, the US became the main superpower, poaching people like Einstein, Enrico Fermi from Italy, who had a Jewish wife, so on and so forth. We know the story. So, and Europe lost the role of superpower in the planet because of, I mean, the bad things we did in Europe are also not giving a good home to researchers. So a fair competition is giving good opportunities to each of us.
Lili, you'd probably like to comment on this, I know, but I see David Mills has a question in the chat, and I've got one other anonymous question. So what I might do is bring David in briefly for his question and also give you the anonymous question, then ask you to close the webinar at that point. Zach, I'm sorry, we'll need to hear from you next time if that's okay. So David.
Yes, thanks, Sam. Thanks, Lili. Giulio, that's a really interesting paper. So I was just reading the paper and trying to make sense of the quants. And Lili, you did respond to my question in the chat, saying that that people could have a range of quality of publications. And I was just wondering whether that's a sign of risk taking. Actually, rather than it being a sign of underperformance, it's really good if you try and take risks, and that you might sometimes get a really good paper and sometimes get a less good paper. So I think just a comment on the distribution of the low quality papers within the sample might be quite interesting to think about. Thanks.
Now, the anonymous question is following. Access to information might be somewhat limited in China. This might have more unpleasant impact on researchers in certain subject fields. How would this affect those returnees in their research? Will this impact on their publication performances? So can I ask each of you to take one bite at these two questions, and then we'll close the webinar.
Sorry, I didn't. Could you repeat which can influence the research performance?
I'll just repeat the question, the anonymous question. It's access to information might be somewhat limited in China. This might have more unpleasant impact on researchers in certain subject fields. How would this affect these returnees in their research? Will this impact on their publication performances?
Thank you very much. That's an important question. I think for these recipients, because they are mainly in STEM areas, so that information access is, in my views, it's not often a very relevant thing, because it's mainly science areas. But for example, if the question is referring to this access to, for example, infrastructure or research data, etc. So these recipients are very actively in maintaining and seeking to establish new international collaboration, but also compared to their counterparts in the US, they are relatively worse off in terms of maintaining those international connections. So in that sense, returning back to China may have this negative influence on their later on research performance.
Yeah, basically looking at the distribution as it is key to understand is non-linear dynamic. And in terms, the discussion is, for some people, it doesn't work. It didn't work that much to go back to China for whatever the reason. Could be a matter of discipline as well, but here we are looking at STEM basically, and usually it works pretty well, the Chinese system to this regard. I'm a little more skeptical about humanities, social sciences, because of politics, because of perhaps you are not always free to say whatever you want in publications, maybe in that kind of realm. But if you do physics, these kind of things, or telecommunications, etc., to some extent sounds like in China you have more freedom than here because of more money, more time, etc. But the problems in disciplines, I would say, probably they are in the soft side of the spectrum, humanities and social sciences. As far as I understand, also from qualitative research I'm doing with Xinshu right now.
Yeah, and David's question reminds us that a lot of the very, very best work doesn't get published in top tier journals. Nonetheless, the papers become eventually influential and matter a lot. But perhaps that's a social science view. I mean, I think it's hard to get papers, really path-breaking papers, into top journals in social science because of the orthodoxy that tends to prevail. But maybe in the natural sciences, that's not always the case. That you would hope that at least that in most disciplines, the very best work ends up in the very best journals, but it may not be so. And it's an important issue, an important question for us, because we've got this enormously effective system of research and science in driving quantitative growth and performance, and with everyone out there trying to build their careers through building their quantity of good publications. But gee, you know, that doesn't necessarily translate into path-breaking work that really makes us think differently about society and nature. And that's the work that really matters. And it's making sure that kind of work is being produced wherever it's being produced, in China, the United States, and everywhere else, that we should really be directing our attention to. And if we could slow the performative juggernaut to ensure we had better path-breaking research, I think we'd all do it if we could. Thanks very much for your contribution. Very well informed, well argued, and illustrated. And we're very glad to have you both on the show. Come back again and bring us your research again. Our next webinar is taking place next Tuesday. And it's interesting because it's a master's student, someone who's still doing a master's and has brought forward a body of research of international importance into the webinar program. So we really look forward to hearing from Astrid Favela on Tuesday with the topic of European higher education systems and their progress since the financial crisis in relation to equity and high school formation in research capacity, and focusing particularly on everyone's favourite country in Europe, Portugal and the Netherlands. So we look forward to Astrid on Tuesday, and we thank again Lili and Giulio. Bye for now.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.